Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. Man, this first full week back from July 4th is really going fast. Yesterday was a chaotic day for Mrs. Stowers and I. We traveled back from San Diego to our home here in Scottsdale. In doing so, I failed to bring most of my computer equipment, which caused just a little bit of problems. The replacement equipment, I know you guys don't care about this, but the replacement equipment that we got did not work. Frustrating. Really put a challenge. I'm behind on quite a few things, so sorry. I wasn't able to get my LinkedIn post yesterday and barely got out a Facebook Live session. So if you check that session out, thank you. I was off the cuff. I had all sorts of problems, including I did it in my car where my phone overheated and shut off. So just challenges. It's okay. It's all part of the process. Also, we brought Mr. COVID back with us from San Diego. We think we're at the tail end of it. Thankfully, COVID is just a cold today. But we should be pulling out of it. And so that gets me to today, Thursday. Now we're caught up. I know everybody watching wanted to hear that. You may or may not have cared about the travels of Mrs. Stowers and I, but hopefully you care about this next topic, which is it's Thursday. It's the New Normal series. And I'm going to talk about the new normal forever. Because the new normal, of course, is a horizon that is always in the distance. You never really arrive at the new normal. You never arrive at the horizon. You just get to the tip of the horizon that you can see, and then there's a horizon past that, and past that, and past that. But I think our industry is really facing a gigantic shift, a change. A lot of the change is coming from changing consumer behavior, which we've talked about and I'll continue to talk about. Some of it is from technology, some from new processes. And all this is creating this, vortex that is going to lead us to massive change. And we can capitalize on the change. We can get in front of the change. We could be leaders in change. And then we become leaders in the industry. And my purpose on the New Normal series is to encourage everyone to prepare for the new normal, prepare for what's coming up. And so my hope is to give some insights into what I think the new normal will be, which many of you can disagree with, to give maybe some opinions about how to prepare. And trust me, I know a lot of you will disagree with my prescription to how to thrive in the new normal, but hopefully it gets us all thinking about what we need to do to succeed in the new normal. And then to go back and let's explain the concept of the new normal. I believe that the last couple of years, this year, we are like a Spanish galleon, a wood boat, trying to cross the ocean. And we came upon a massive storm, a bigger storm than we've experienced, maybe even one bigger than we knew we could survive. And so we've been all hands on deck trying to survive this storm. And for us in the mortgage and real estate business, but in the mortgage business, what that means is, we've seen volume drop from 4.1 trillion. Let me adjust this really quick. From 4.1 trillion to 1.4 trillion last year. And maybe it's going to be 1.65 this year. Massive change. And we've seen margins shrink. We've seen comp shrink. We've seen our referral sources dry up and go away. We've seen some of the most strongest funnels for business evaporate. And we've certainly seen a new type of competition where not only do we have to compete to keep the loan up to the day of closing, but now even past closing. We have to protect against EPOs. And so everything is changing, and this is a big storm, right? And so we're all companies, we're trying to get through the storm. All loan officers, we're trying to figure out, cut our expenses, cut our monthly nut, the costs that we need to live on, try to fortify our value, improve our sales skills, try to figure out how to get to the customer, get to the top of the funnel, that as we go through this storm, right? And the thing I say as a strategist, what I say is, that's all well and good. We have to survive the storm. But trust me, when we go back to shore, it's not the shore we left from. The land our ship is going to land in is going to be completely new and totally different, completely different. And my focus is what is that new land going to look like? What's that new normal going to be? And how are we going to thrive in that new normal? And why it's important, as I advise CEOs, as I advise companies, my advice is if we can't thrive when we land in the new normal, then there's no reason to go through the struggle of the storm. Preserve your capital, sell your company, sell it to your employees, whatever. But if you don't think you can thrive when you get to the new land, don't struggle through the storm. It makes no sense. Don't burn through tens of millions of dollars. It makes no sense, right? Only if you think you can thrive in the new normal, right, should you struggle through the storm. And this goes for loan officers too, right? Loan officers or real estate agents, you're burning through your savings, but you got this mass bounty, thankfully, with gratitude in 2020, 2021, but then 2022 and the 2023 started to eat through that savings, right? Well, don't burn through the savings if you don't think you're going to thrive in the new normal. That's just dumb. You can, and this is no criticism, but we can go work for UPS and make $160,000 a year. That's the average UPS guy makes, right? No need to go through our savings to struggle for something where we're not going to succeed. Now, I'm not telling anybody to get out of the business. I'm not telling any owner to sell the business. My encouragement would be, let's start building what the value we need, the foundation we need to succeed in the land of the new normal. That's my encouragement. But you have to look at yourself in the mirror and go, that's not me. That's not what I want to do. That's not my strategy. And if so, pick a strategy that works for you. Now, I know quite a few owners, and by the way, loan officers and real estate agents that say, hey, what I've done has always worked. I believe it's going to continue to work. I'm going to ride this horse until it's dead on the ground. When it's dead on the ground, I will dismount, and that's when I'll walk on, I'll walk into my new future, whatever that may be. Now, that's not my strategy. That's not what I would advise, but I respect that. It's a strategy. So that's the background for the new normal. That's what I'm talking about on Thursdays. Today, I want to talk about expenses, and this is my favorite topic. This is largely targeted to C-suite folks because they control expenses, but some of it goes to loan officers and even real estate agents. Your business is the same, but when I talk about expenses, think about the role you play in the problem, right? And expenses are a problem. Expenses create friction with our customers, right? And if you're a loan officer and you work for a company and you complain your company's rates are high, I promise you 9 times out of 10, it's not your company's execution on the secondary money market. It's not your company's profit goal, meaning they don't have a fat margin to make a ton of money. In fact, most IMBs have lost money for 8 quarters. Now you can kind of play with the numbers as all IMBs do, and there's not a lot of truth serum in what's being reported, and the numbers are obfuscated by servicing value and selling servicing and servicing revenue. But generally speaking, it's safe to say IMBs lost a ton of money the last 2 years, right? And so they're not, and the reason why I point this out is your rates aren't high because they're making a ton of money. The opposite is true, right? There was a quarter where the average IMB lost 100 basis points per loan. It couldn't be more untrue that your rates are high because your company is trying to make money. Not true at all, right? If your rates are high, it's because your expenses are high. That's why your rates are high. It's not execution. It's not greed. It's an expense issue. And by the way, if you're a loan officer, a branch manager, I don't care, whoever you are, if your rates are high, you are probably contributing to the problem, right? Loan officers make a ton of demands about high comp, high support, high marketing expenses, all these high expenses, and then they complain their company's rates are high. That makes no sense. If you're a loan officer, you have to educate yourself into the role you play, into the rates you deliver, right? So as I talk about expenses, I am talking mostly to C-suite folks, but if you're a loan officer, pay attention and see what role you play in keeping your company's expenses elevated. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of general concepts today. I'm going to get in much more detail in the weeks to come, but first just understand, expenses are friction with your clients, period. And when I talk friction, my favorite example of friction, I remember watching a movie maybe in the 80s, mid 80s, late 80s on Howard Hughes. And it was a great movie. I can't find it now. I don't know what it was or who started it, but it was a really good movie. And of course, Howard was kind of an odd duck. But I remember the part of the movie that like stays with me, that I continually go back to, is there's a part of the movie where Howard Hughes, his company, is trying to build the fastest plane in the world. And back then, the planes were aluminum skins, and Howard was just obsessed with breaking the world speed record in 1935. And he lived above the manufacturer floor, and every morning he would go down to this prototype plane, and he'd run his hand down the fuselage, and then back then, and still some planes, what happens is you rivet two pieces of aluminum together. That's how you create the skin. And Howard would go down the floor and he'd run his hand across the fuselage, and his hand would go across the rivets, and he would tell the lead engineer, we need less friction. We need less friction. You need to grind down these rivets. And rivets create friction, which slow us down. And so every day, and the film goes every morning, hey, and I forget the guy's name, the engineer's name, less friction, less friction, less friction. And he'd run his hand over the fuselage. And by the way, that contributed to what's called flush rivets. Now, Howard Hughes didn't create flush rivets, but he certainly perfected it, right? And the plane, the H-1 Racer, did set a speed record in 1935. It was the last airplane to set, privately built to set a speed record. Since then, it's been military planes, right? So the H-1 was the last one to set a speed record. But when I visualize walking down the plane and feeling the friction of the rivets, that's how I feel about expenses in a mortgage company, right? We have all these expenses, and do they do anything? Do they add any value, right? And I think you should just put every expense under the microscope and go, is that a rivet that adds friction with my customers? Is that a rivet that adds friction with my employees? And if so, you got to grind down the rivet, right? And some of these things, some of these expenses are sneaky, right? And by the way, a lot of these expenses, these I call excess expenses, they don't add value to the client, and the client doesn't care. Let's use an example. Let's say in 2020, we're booming, the average processor closed 20 files a month or 25 files a month, right? But today, with unit volume down, maybe our best processors are closing 10 files a month, right? So they're at 40% capacity. Therefore, right, they are 5 times more expensive, right? Just by spreading out fixed expenses, they're more expensive per loan. If you take whatever their cost is, let's just pretend it's $10,000 a month all in with benefits and everything, and you divide it by 25 versus 10, you get the idea. They're far more expensive. And so they have slack capacity. Now, let me ask you, does a client want to pay for your slack capacity? No, not at all. They don't care that you have slack capacity. They want maximum efficiency. And so that expense of the slack capacity becomes friction with your clients, right? That's what I mean. That's an example. There's more examples. How about the cost of uncollected credit reports or Work Number? That is the money we spend on credit reports and Work Number for clients that never close. And let's say we convert 25% of our leads or 25% of our credit reports to close loans. So 75%, of our credit expenses and Work Numbers are never collected. Well, as a company, how are we going to pay for that, right? What we essentially do is we take those expenses and we spread them over the loans that we close. Now, if I'm closing a loan with you, do I want to pay for the 3 people that didn't? No. And what that's called is other borrowers' costs. Our borrowers do not want to pay for other borrowers' costs, period, right? And when we make them pay for it, that causes friction. And by the way, this friction is expressed in higher rates. And so we think that we can hide this friction, hide these expenses by raising our rates slightly, and then our rates get out of the market, and what do we want to do? We want to take a PE and lower them, right? And so that's friction when a borrower goes, hey, I just checked rates for other places, you're high. And then we have to cut the cost, which means we have to spread that expense over more other borrowers, right? And so slack capacity, friction. Other borrowers' costs, friction. Here's another friction, by the way, is, gosh, I need to make at least X amount of money. So therefore, and I'm only closing one loan a month, so I got to charge that one client X. And I heard this. I heard this early on in the NAR lawsuits and settlement. I swear to you, I heard on a national stage. I heard somebody arguing why buyer commissions are worth it, because what the buyer doesn't understand is how many people a buyer's agent has to work with before they get a closed deal. Do you think that buyer cares? Do you think they want to pay for, okay, you helped 10 people that didn't close, I got to pay for your services that you provided them through the service you provide me? No, right? Or, hey, I'm the only one you're closing this month, you need to make $10,000 a month, so you need to make $10,000 off me? No, that's not going to work. That is not going to work in the new normal, right? The new normal, where the borrower wants more for less, is highly portable, and, by the way, whom we have to compete for from the beginning of the lead to the day it closes to post-close, which we've talked about, and by time I'll talk about it more. I'm already over time, so I probably won't talk about it more today, right? So, and then finally, you know what else the borrower doesn't want to pay for? Your low standards. Right? If you don't know how to train and support and how to execute standards so that you have KPIs that give you efficiency and scale, your borrowers don't want to pay for that. You know, if your processors can only close 5 loans a month, that's what your system allows, versus your competitor doing 25, each delivering the same customer service, they don't want to pay for that. They want you to have high standards, to have high KPIs, to deliver a high level of customer joy and excitement, but not at a high cost. Those are things we have to solve for, right? We gotta solve for that. And the trick here is, what's an expense versus an investment? Because one thing is, borrowers want more for less. I didn't say they want less for less. I didn't say they want more for more. They want more for less. So we have to figure out how to delight them, how to deliver real value, more value to them, right? And so we have to cut expenses to the bone on things they don't care about, that don't add value to them or our employees. And then we have to radically invest in things that give them overwhelming value, overwhelming delight. And that's a trick, because it's very hard. A lot of owners, a lot of sweet people have a hard time bifurcating their strategy. Cut expenses, make great investments. But we have to learn how to do that. We really do. And part of that, which I'll take up on another time, we'll talk about how to invest in technology, what technology is an expense, what technology is an investment, what technology is the minimum ante required, what technology can delight your customers. We'll talk about that in another New Normal series on Thursday. I'm going to wrap up, because I see I'm going long, I'm going to wrap up with 2 concepts. And the first one I'm going to borrow from Mr. Dan Hansen. And I love Dan Hansen. I learned a lot from Dan Hansen, as have probably half the industry, all right? But I remember Dan in one of his early presentations when he joined a company I was with, he was talking about expenses. This is like day 1, by the way. And he came up there on stage and he said, look, if God forsake, one of your employees was ran over by a bus and killed, and you did no fewer loans, then you don't need that employee, right? And what a hardcore way to look at it. But what a true way, right? And the problem is, we get these colored glasses on that completely miscalculates people's value, right? And we start to value Peggy or Bob or Billy or Jim or whoever, and we think they're essential to the company. But if they got ran over by a bus and we didn't do one less loan, or we didn't have the potential to grow the way we wanted to, or have the value the way we wanted to, we probably don't need that person on the team. That person is creating friction with our borrowers. And yet it's very hard to think that way. If you were a C-suite person and you look down your entire list of employees and you use that as your barometer and go, nope, we don't lose a loan. Nope, we don't lose a loan. Oh, we would suffer a lot. Oh, we'd be much weaker. If you did that, it would really be a really good weather vane on who should stay and who should go. So that's one device to use, the ran over by a bus device. Dan, I don't think you listen to these, but thank you for giving me that viewpoint. Here's something else, and this is really the exercise, and I recommend this whenever I get a chance to speak to a C-suite person or a CEO. We talk about expenses. I always say the same thing. You gotta Apollo 13 your expenses, and here's what I mean. Apollo 13, the thing that happened, the rocket went in the air. They had a bunch of catastrophes. They lost power. They didn't know how they were going to get them back to Earth. They were out in orbit. They had minimum power, and what they figured out, the spaceship could only generate 20 amps of power. And if they went over 20 amps of power, the whole thing would cease to work, and then they'd crash and die. So the thing was, we have to land this spaceship on 20 amps, which is a little more than a modern toaster uses, right? We got to get this giant spaceship from the 70s or 80s back to Earth, tens of thousands of miles, using 20 amps. And when that became the challenge, something that they didn't think that they could achieve, but when they accepted, the only way it was going to work is if they accepted that challenge, then they figured it out. It's the same way with a mortgage company. You can't go, because when we go to cut expenses, like if you get the executive team in a boardroom and you're like, okay, let's look at expenses, and there's so many sacred cows and there's so many limiting beliefs about what a useful expense is, that you could probably have somebody on the team veto cutting every single expense. Now, sometimes they're pet projects, sometimes there's conceptual, right? Because they're looking at it not as what need to have, but what we'd like to have. And when you go Apollo 13, we only have 20 amps. If we go Apollo 13 on our expense stack, and look, our entire expense stack, top to bottom, needs to be X, and we need to engineer to X, then you can solve it. Right? But if you don't pick X and make X really a great number, a difficult number, you won't get there, right? So if you're going to X, that means you're going to look at loan officer comp, you're going to look at overhead, you got to look at executive comp, you got to look at technology, all those things like Slack capacity. You got to look at everything. And if you set the goal and you reverse engineer it, you're much more likely to succeed. And you'll make really, really tough cuts. And that's it. Left on its own, we don't want to make tough cuts, right? Because tough cuts, what do? We fear retention issues, right? If I cut sales support, if I cut LO comp, it's going to cause friction with my employees and retention, even though the only thing we're trying to do is reduce the friction with our employees so we can do more business, right? Or if you if you go to cut expenses and you go, gosh, Bob, Jim, Ron, whoever, they've been instrumental, they've been here 5 years. It doesn't matter if they don't add the value you need today, right? And so you got to make those cuts. You got to find a way to create an environment where you feel safe to make the cuts you need to make. Because here's one of the things. A lot of owners falsely believe in my opinion, that look, hey, this isn't an expense problem, it's a unit problem, right? Under the whole fixed variable expenses, if we can just spread our fixed expenses over more units, it lowers our overall unit cost, and that will bring us into alignment to profit. That's the thought, right? One, I can tell you, owners way overestimate their fixed expenses versus their variable expenses. They're way too optimistic on fixed expenses, thinking that, just 100 more units a month or 1,000 more units a month, and we're profitable just like in 2020. Right? So they misunderstand that, in my opinion. Second, they're completely Pollyannish, or we are completely Pollyannish, that we don't have an increase in fixed expenses when our business increases. That fixed expenses stay static. I don't believe that one bit. And what that means is, look, if I'm closing 100 loans a month or 1,000 loans a month this month, and I'm doing it with 50 processors, that if I get to 1,200 loans a month, I'm going to do it with the same 50 processors with no overtime. That'll have no additional expense going that extra 200 units. And the truth is, that's false, right? If you went from 1,000 to 1,200, you're not in shape to do the 1,200, you're not as efficient, you're going to have overtime, you're going to have people complaining, we need more employees, you're inevitably going to hire more folks, right? And so it's not static. And I could go through almost every expense line except for most occupancy expenses. But fixed expenses, the things that your CFO, your accountants will call fixed expenses, have some elasticity to them. They're not 100% fixed. And furthermore, if you look at your entire expense stack, fewer of your expenses are fixed than you think. And I'm much more an advocate. You have to figure out how to make a profit per widget in any market, right? In this market. Because here's another thing. There's another completely, I believe, false belief that, look, when volume comes back, when we have the next refi boom, margins are coming back. Margins are never coming back. They're not. Margins are going to get thinner and thinner. And in fact, the front of the next refi boom are going to demand super thin margins because you have all sorts of low-cost providers that have already outpositioned the market to win that business at a very low margin and a very low expense stack. And if IMBs want to play in that space, they're going to have to meet that expense stack, and that's going to, if they don't, cure their expenses beforehand, it will bankrupt them. And the other thing, it will create all sorts of friction with our employees. If we have high rates, our employees can't compete in the refi market because we've allowed our expense stack to get larded up, and then they're having to compete, and they're going, hey, how come XYZ is offering 4.5 today, and we're offering 5.5. Right? And so I'm a disciple of fix your expenses to any market. Fix them now. You got to grind those rivets down. We need flush rivets. We need less expenses to thrive in the new normal. And if we're unwilling to do that, then we probably need to look at what's our exit strategy. Anyway, like I said, I give you some food for thought. I went super long today. I apologize. I got a ton more on this topic. Stay tuned on Thursdays. The new normal. There's no sacred cow on topics on the new normal. I promise you, if you stay with me on the new normal, I will at some point offend you, or you will disagree with me. You will tell me why I'm wrong, and I respect that, right? Because I'm not trying to say I have all the answers. What I do hope is to get you thinking about what you need to do to thrive in the new normal, whether you're a CEO, owner, C-suite, branch manager, loan officer, real estate agent. Look in the mirror, have a heart-to-heart talk to yourself. When I land in the land of new normal, what's it going to look like? What do I need to do today to thrive in that land of the new normal? So thank you for hanging out with me on a Thursday. I appreciate it. I appreciate for going long today. I will try to shorten these up. I hope you have a terrific day, and I will be back tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.